What if I told you that the person you're most afraid of becoming is actually the person you need to become? What if your deepest fears about yourself are actually pointing toward your greatest potential? Think about it for a moment. We all have that voice in our head, don't we? The one that whispers things like, "What if I'm too ambitious?" Or, "What if people think I'm being too bold?" Or, "What if I fail spectacularly when I try to be my authentic self?" Here's something fascinating. Most of us spend our entire lives running away from who we truly are. Not because we're lazy or cowardly, but because we're terrified of our own power. We're scared of what might happen if we actually showed up as our full selves in this world. Today, we're going to dive deep into this paradox. We're going to explore why we fear our authentic selves, what psychology and philosophy tell us about this phenomenon, and most importantly, how we can transform that fear into fuel for becoming who we're truly meant to be. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's embark on this journey together. Because by the end of our time today, you'll have a completely different relationship with that person you've been afraid to become. Let's start with the basics. What does it actually mean to become who you're afraid to be? At its core, this concept is about the gap between who we are and who we could be. But here's the twist. It's not just any version of ourselves we're talking about. It's specifically the version that scares us the most. Now, why would we be afraid of our own potential? This seems counterintuitive, right? Shouldn't we be excited about becoming better versions of ourselves? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The self we're afraid to become usually represents three things. First, it represents our highest potential. The version of us that would require us to step completely outside our comfort zone. Second, it represents vulnerability, because being authentic means risking rejection, criticism, or failure. And third, it represents responsibility, because once we become who we truly are, we can no longer make excuses or hide behind our limitations. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine someone who has always been the quiet one in their family and friend groups. They've built their identity around being the listener, the supporter, the one who stays in the background. But deep down, they have ideas, opinions, and dreams that they're burning to share. The person they're afraid to become is the one who speaks up, who takes center stage, who risks being seen and potentially criticized. This fear isn't irrational. It's actually quite logical. When we step into our authentic selves, we risk losing the safety of our current identity. We risk discovering that we might fail, that people might not like this new version of us, or that we might have to face responsibilities we've been avoiding. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure. When we commit to an identity too early and then resist changing it, even when that identity no longer serves us. It's like wearing clothes that are too small but refusing to buy new ones because at least you know these clothes fit at some point. But here's what's crucial to understand. The fear itself is often a compass. The things we're most afraid of becoming are often pointing us toward our greatest growth opportunities. Why? Because fear usually shows up at the edge of our comfort zone, right where transformation happens. So when we talk about becoming who you're afraid to be, we're really talking about courage. The courage to outgrow the small, safe version of yourself and step into the expanded, authentic version that's been waiting inside you all along. Now that we understand what this concept means, let's explore what some of history's greatest thinkers have said about this very human struggle. Throughout history, philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual teachers have grappled with this exact phenomenon, our tendency to resist becoming our authentic selves. Let's start with Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who gave us some of the most profound insights into human psychology. Jung talked about what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who society expects you to be. He believed that most people live what he called provisional lives, always preparing to live but never actually living authentically. Jung observed that we often project our unrealized potential onto others. We admire certain qualities in other people, their confidence, their creativity, their boldness, while simultaneously believing these qualities are somehow not available to us. He called this our shadow. Not just the dark parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge, but also the bright parts we're too afraid to claim. Here's Jung's radical insight. What we resist in ourselves often contains the key to our transformation. The very traits we're afraid to embody are often the ones we need most to develop. Moving forward in time, let's look at existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. They introduced us to the concept of bad faith, the idea that we often pretend we have no choice in who we become, when in reality, we're constantly choosing who to be through our actions and decisions. Sartre famously said, "Man is condemned to be free." What he meant is that we're constantly faced with the responsibility of creating ourselves, and this responsibility can be terrifying. It's much easier to believe that we're stuck being who we've always been than to acknowledge that we have the power, and therefore the responsibility, to become someone new. But perhaps no one understood this concept better than the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He wrote extensively about what he called the dread of freedom. Kierkegaard observed that when we're faced with the possibility of becoming our authentic selves, we often experience anxiety, not because the outcome would be bad, but because the outcome is unknown. He used a beautiful metaphor, standing at the edge of a cliff. The anxiety we feel isn't really about falling. It's about the possibility that we might jump. In other words, we're afraid of our own freedom to choose transformation. Now let's bring this into the modern era with Abraham Maslow's work on self-actualization. Maslow studied people who he considered to be living at their highest potential, and he noticed something fascinating. They all went through what he called the Jonah Complex, the fear of their own greatness. Just like the biblical Jonah who ran away from his calling, Maslow observed that people often run away from their own talents, their own potential, and their own possibilities for growth. We're not just afraid of failure. We're often equally afraid of success, of being powerful, of being seen in our full magnificence. More recently, psychologist Steven Pressfield wrote about what he calls resistance, that internal force that shows up whenever we're about to do something that matters to our soul's evolution. Resistance, according to Pressfield, is strongest when we're about to make a breakthrough into becoming who we're meant to be. But here's what all these thinkers understood. This fear is not a bug in the human system. It's a feature. It's actually a sign that we're on the right track. The fear shows up precisely because what we're about to do matters deeply. So how do we work with this fear instead of against it? How do we use it as fuel for transformation, rather than letting it keep us stuck? Well, that leads us perfectly into our next section, where we'll explore practical solutions and approaches. Now that we understand the psychology and philosophy behind this fear, let's talk about how to actually work with it in daily life. Because understanding is only the first step. Transformation happens through action. The first principle I want to share with you is what I call befriending your fear. Instead of trying to eliminate fear, which is impossible and actually counterproductive, we need to learn to dance with it. Here's a practical exercise. The next time you feel that familiar fear about stepping into a bigger version of yourself, try this. Instead of pushing the fear away, get curious about it. Ask yourself, what is this fear trying to protect me from? Often you'll discover that the fear is actually trying to keep you safe from something that hurt you in the past. For example, maybe you're afraid to be more visible because when you were a child, being noticed meant being criticized. Your fear is actually your inner protection system trying to keep you safe. Once you understand this, you can have a conversation with your fear. You can say, "Thank you for trying to protect me, but I'm ready to take this risk now." The second principle is what I call identity experimentation. Instead of trying to make massive changes overnight, start experimenting with small versions of who you want to become. Let's say you're afraid to be more creative because you've always been the logical one. Don't quit your job and become an artist tomorrow. Instead, start carrying a notebook and jot down interesting ideas. Take a weekend workshop. Share one creative thought with a friend. Let yourself play in the space between who you are and who you're becoming. This approach works because it allows your nervous system to gradually adjust to the new identity. It's like slowly turning up the temperature in a pot of water instead of throwing a frog into boiling water. The third principle is understanding what I call the authenticity paradox. Here's something counterintuitive. The more authentic you become, the more some people will like you, and the more some people will dislike you. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. When you're being inauthentic, you get lukewarm responses from everyone. When you're being authentic, you get passionate responses, both positive and negative. The people who resonate with your authentic self will be drawn to you like magnets, while the people who don't will naturally fall away. This can feel scary because we're wired to want everyone to like us. But here's the truth. Universal likability is the enemy of authentic impact. You can't light up the people who are meant to be in your life if you're dimming your light to avoid offending the people who aren't. Now let's talk about some specific strategies you can use starting today. First, practice what I call courageous conversations. These are conversations where you share something true about yourself that you normally wouldn't share. It might be an opinion, a dream, a fear, or simply something you're excited about. Start small, maybe with one person you trust, and gradually expand. Second, try the 5% rule. Every week, be 5% more of who you're afraid to become. If you're afraid to be more assertive, practice saying no to one small thing this week. If you're afraid to be more creative, spend 15 minutes doing something creative. Small, consistent steps compound into massive transformation over time. Third, create what I call identity anchors. These are regular practices or rituals that help you connect with the person you're becoming. It might be a morning journaling practice where you write as the person you're becoming, or an evening reflection where you acknowledge one way you showed up authentically that day. Fourth, surround yourself with people who see and encourage your authentic self. This might mean joining new communities, finding mentors, or simply spending more time with the friends who love you for who you really are, not who you think you should be. But what about when you inevitably face setbacks? What about when you try to be more authentic and it doesn't go well? This is where resilience comes in. Every person who has ever transformed their life has faced moments where being authentic felt like a mistake. The key is to remember that these moments aren't failures. They're data points. They're teaching you how to be authentic in a way that's sustainable and true to you. Now that we understand these practical approaches, let's take a look at the most common questions we encounter in life. Because I know you probably have specific questions about how to apply all of this in real life. Let me address some of the most common questions and concerns I hear when we talk about becoming who you're afraid to be. Question 1, what if I try to be more authentic and people reject me? This is probably the most common fear, and it's completely understandable. Here's the thing, some people will reject you. But here's what's equally true. The right people will embrace you more deeply than ever before. Think of authenticity like a filter. It filters out the relationships that were based on a false version of you and strengthens the relationships that are based on who you really are. Yes, you might lose some connections, but the connections you keep and the new ones you make will be infinitely more meaningful. Plus, here's something most people don't realize. When you're being authentic, you give others permission to be authentic too. You often inspire the very thing you're afraid of losing. Question 2. What if I don't know who I really am underneath all the masks I wear? This is a beautiful and honest question. The truth is, discovering who you are is not a destination. It's a journey. You don't need to have it all figured out before you start. Start by paying attention to what energizes you versus what drains you. Notice when you feel most alive, most engaged, most like yourself. Notice what you're drawn to when no one is watching. These are clues to your authentic self. Also, try the deathbed test. Imagine yourself at 95, looking back on your life. What would you regret not trying? What would you wish you had been brave enough to become? That regret is often pointing toward your authentic path. Question 3. What if being my authentic self is selfish or hurts others? This is where we need to distinguish between healthy authenticity and harmful behavior. Being authentic doesn't mean being inconsiderate or cruel. It means being true to your values, your dreams, and your nature while still being kind and respectful to others. In fact, when you're living authentically, you typically become more compassionate, not less, because you're not carrying around the stress and resentment that comes from living a false life. Question 4. What if I'm afraid to be successful or powerful? This is a big one. Many of us have unconscious beliefs that it's dangerous to be powerful or successful. Maybe we grew up thinking that powerful people are bad people, or that success means others have to lose. The first step is recognizing these beliefs. Then look for examples of people who use their power and success in ways you admire. Redefine what success and power mean to you. Maybe success means having the freedom to help others. Maybe power means having the ability to create positive change. Question 5. How do I know the difference between my authentic self and just my ego wanting attention? Great question. Here's a simple test. When you're operating from ego, there's usually a feeling of needing to prove something or be better than others. When you're operating from authenticity, there's usually a feeling of joy, flow, and service. Your authentic self wants to contribute and connect. Your ego wants to compete and control. Your authentic self feels sustainable and peaceful, even when it's challenging. Your ego feels exhausting and anxious, even when it's winning. Question 6. What if I make changes and then realize I was wrong? Here's something liberating. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to try something, learn from it, and adjust course. That's not failure. That's growth. The goal isn't to become the perfect version of yourself overnight. The goal is to keep moving toward greater authenticity, greater aliveness, greater alignment with who you truly are. That's a lifelong journey, not a one-time destination. So now that we've addressed these common concerns, let's bring everything together and talk about how to move forward from here. So where does this leave us? Let's pull together everything we've explored today. We started by understanding that the person we're afraid to become is often the person we most need to become. This fear isn't random. It's actually pointing us toward our greatest potential for growth and authenticity. We learned from great thinkers throughout history that this struggle is universal, from Jung's individuation to Kierkegaard's dread of freedom. We've seen that every human being faces the choice between staying small and safe or growing into who they truly are. We explored practical strategies, befriending your fear instead of fighting it, experimenting with new aspects of your identity, embracing the authenticity paradox, and taking small, consistent steps toward becoming who you're meant to be. And we addressed the real concerns that come up when we consider this path: the fear of rejection, the uncertainty about our true selves, and the worry about being selfish or making mistakes. Here's what I want you to remember as we wrap up. Becoming who you're afraid to be isn't about becoming someone completely different. It's about becoming more fully yourself. It's about removing the layers of conditioning, fear, and false beliefs that have been hiding your true nature. The person you're afraid to become already exists inside you. They're not someone you need to create from scratch. They're someone you need to have the courage to reveal. And here's the beautiful truth. The world needs who you really are. Not another version of someone else, not a watered-down version of yourself, but the full, authentic, powerful, vulnerable, creative, brilliant person that only you can be. So I want to leave you with a challenge. This week, take one small step toward becoming who you're afraid to be. Share one authentic thought. Try one thing that scares you. Have one courageous conversation. Be 5% more of yourself than you were last week. Because here's what I know to be true. The person you're afraid to become is not your enemy. They're your future. They're your freedom. They're your gift to the world. And the world is waiting for you to be brave enough to become them. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. Remember, transformation doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen one brave choice at a time. Until next time, keep becoming. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe.